Moscow, 1977. Russia's parliament marks the 60th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, adopts a new constitution, and hears from the first man to serve as both president and Communist Party secretary. Nikolai Lenin is the architect of the October 1917 uprising that shakes the world when Leonid Brezhnev is only 10 years old. Lenin and his followers are in the minority, but they are dedicated and determined, and their counter-revolution topples the regime that has ruled since Tsar Nicholas II was driven from the throne in March. Lenin's immediate concern is the continuing civil war and the threat of armed intervention by foreign nations. By 1920, the fighting is ended. Now the Soviet leader can concentrate on strengthening his power and laying the groundwork for history's first communist state. January 1924, Nikolai Lenin is dead, and era is ended. A ruthless political commissar calling himself Stalin, the Russian word for steel, holds the country's most powerful post, General Secretary of the Communist Party. He systematically purges potential challengers for power, and in 1929, Joseph Stalin is Russia's undisputed dictator. In the mid-1930s, public trials are used in another purge of political dissidents and Red Army officers. 35,000 military leaders are convicted. When Adolf Hitler breaks a non-aggression treaty with Stalin and invades Russia in June 1941, almost every experienced Soviet combat leader is dead or in a prison camp. America and England come to Russia's aid, and President Franklin Roosevelt, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Premier Joseph Stalin formed the Big Three of World War II. When victory is won, allies become adversaries. Soviet troops occupy Eastern Europe. An Iron Curtain descends across the continent. Puppet regimes are set up in Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia. By 1950, the Soviet Empire stretches farther than it ever did under the Tsar. After almost 30 years of unparalleled power, Joseph Stalin dies at 74 on March 5, 1953. The next day, Georgy Malenkov succeeds Stalin as Premier and Communist Party Secretary. Within 2 years, he is ousted from both jobs. Breaking tradition and traveling abroad, Russia's new leaders are Nikolai Bulganin and Nikita Khrushchev. Bulganin is Premier, Khrushchev Party Secretary. But as time goes by, Khrushchev assumes more and more power until he becomes the true successor to Stalin. The People's Republic of China has joined the roster of communist countries, and comrades Khrushchev and Mao Zedong pledge economic and military solidarity. Next, a daring gamble by Nikita Khrushchev at the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party in 1956. He denounces Joseph Stalin as a murderer, maniac, and military blunderer. Delegates applaud the attack. Khrushchev's power is secure. 3 years later, a dramatic turnabout in Soviet-American relations. Khrushchev becomes the first Russian head of state to visit America. The animated Soviet leader is a man of changing faces and contrasting moods as he pursues his self-proclaimed policy of peaceful coexistence between the free and communist worlds. 1961, a year of achievement for Soviet scientists in the race for space. Yuri Gagarin has become the first human to orbit the Earth, and crowds in Moscow's Red Square salute the 27-year-old cosmonaut. The night is a propaganda victory for the Soviet Union, and Gagarin is caught up in a Russian bear hug by Soviet Defense Minister Malinovsky. Later, the cosmonaut is decorated by Leonid Brezhnev, an up-and-coming member of the Politburo. In 1962, American reconnaissance planes discover Russian-equipped missile sites in Cuba. When the Soviet Union is forced to back down and remove the missiles, Khrushchev suffers an embarrassing diplomatic defeat. Another setback is Mao Zedong's feud with Moscow over theories and tactics of world communism. The final break comes when Mao denounces the 1963 nuclear test ban treaty. April 1964, Nikita Khrushchev is honored on his 70th birthday. Your remarkable deeds, says Leonid Brezhnev, have earned you the love of all the Soviet people. 5 months and 28 days later, Khrushchev is ousted, and his successor as Communist Party Secretary, Leonid Brezhnev, denounces the deposed leader as a harebrained schemer, immature, and a braggart. Now, following in the footsteps of Stalin and Khrushchev, the new party secretary sets out to strengthen his power in the Politburo that rules the Soviet Union. Traveling to Hungary, he meets with Janos Kadar, premier of the Soviet satellite. In this and other countries under Soviet influence, Leonid Brezhnev seeks to end what he calls the international disorder created by Khrushchev and to restore Moscow's domination over world communism. Brezhnev represents a new generation of Soviet leadership, for as a child he played no part in the Bolshevik Revolution. But he remains firmly committed in dealings with satellite states and Western countries to making Russian-style communism supreme everywhere in the world. In 1967, on the 50th anniversary of the revolution, many of the Bolshevik promises remain unfulfilled. With twice as much land and a greater population, the Soviet economy produces less than half as much as the United States. But militarily, Russia's active duty manpower is greater. In addition to superiority in manpower and conventional weapons, the Soviet Union's arsenal of ballistic missiles is believed to equal the U.S. stockpile of strategic atomic weapons. The Golden Jubilee includes special ceremonies honoring Nikolai Lenin. Although he ruled for less than 7 years, Lenin, the Russian people are told, is more alive than the living. Leonid Brezhnev unveils a statue of the man who is virtually deified by more than 1 billion people around the world. And yet the Soviet Union in 1967 is more like the regimented society created by Stalin than the communist state left by Lenin. Whatever the legacy, Russia is remarkably changed on its 50th birthday. Special assembly of Communist Party members in the Kremlin, delegates hear first from Nikolai Podgorny, who holds the largely ceremonial post of president. Next, the dignitaries listen to Party Secretary Brezhnev elaborate on a new concept of communism called the Brezhnev Doctrine. Satellite nations may enjoy qualified sovereignty, he says, but the Soviet Union retains the right to invade any country that threatens to change its political structure or desert the satellite camp. There can be only one brand of communism, and it must conform to the Moscow line. In 1968, the Brezhnev Doctrine is put to the test in Czechoslovakia. A summit meeting of communist leaders is held in July, and a grim-faced Leonid Brezhnev and Alexei Kosygin demand that Czech Premier Alexander Dubček abandon his liberal policies. An agreement apparently is reached and signed, first by the communist bloc officials, and then by Brezhnev himself. Differences seem to have been resolved and a crisis avoided as the two communists say goodbye and go their separate ways. Not so. Within a month, Czechoslovakia is invaded and occupied by an estimated 600,000 troops from the Soviet Union, Poland, Bulgaria, East Germany, and Hungary. The people of Prague are stunned by the massive display of military might. One Czech kicks a tank in bitter frustration. Others curse at armored troop carriers in symbolic gestures of defiance. While there is no large-scale resistance against the invaders, throughout the city, tanks are set afire and sabotage carried out. Czechoslovakia's failure to mend its liberal ways, says Leonid Brezhnev, necessitated the armed invasion. Even as the wounded are removed to hospitals, the country's leaders are purged, and occupation rights granted to Russian troops. Czechoslovakia has paid the price for daring to defy the Brezhnev doctrine. In 1972, détente becomes a part of Soviet foreign policy as Kremlin leaders welcome President Nixon to Moscow. The chief executive joins Party Secretary Brezhnev in signing a series of agreements on trade, space exploration, and limiting strategic arms. Despite the emphasis on détente, Leonid Brezhnev reaffirms his belief in the inevitable triumph of international communism. But he also realizes American capital can help to modernize Soviet industry and improve Russian living standards. Moscow, May Day, 1977. For Nikolai Podgorny, it left his last May Day as president of the Soviet Union. Leonid Brezhnev is set to complete the consolidation of power that began with the ouster of Nikita Khrushchev in 1964. Podgorny is relieved of his office, and Brezhnev becomes the first man to serve as president and Communist Party secretary. At the same time, a proposed new constitution, the first since 1936, is made public. The document guarantees freedom of speech, assembly, press, and religion, but it also says the use of these rights must not injure the interests of society and the state. Thus, the government can legally keep the Soviet people from exercising the basic human rights that the Constitution is supposed to protect. The document is approved unanimously by the Supreme Soviet, Russia's rubber stamp parliament. 70 years have passed since the 1917 revolution. Communist leadership has been handed down and passed on, Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, until alone and apparently unchallenged at the top stands Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev.